the change of administration in 2010, we'll have to wait and see. Now, in this final session, we're going to shift the focus, as I understand it, and look at US, Brazil in the region, and challenges to US and Brazilian leadership in the region. And that begs a whole range of questions. I mean, what is the region that we're talking about? There are no natural regions. Regions are socially constructed and politically contested and historically constantly changing. From the point of view of the United States, the region was always the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. The recent book published by Brookings is Hemispheric Partnership. We have 2 of the 5 members of the panel with hemisphere in their job descriptions and titles. From Jefferson through Pan-Americanism through to the summit of the Americas in the 1990s, this has been the view of US governments. And the idea, of course, was that the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, were US-led. The hegemonic power in the hemisphere was always, and has always been, the United States, with perhaps Brazil as a special, somewhat slightly privileged partner amongst the other countries in the hemisphere. The only time I've been doing some research on the origin of the term Latin America and the use of the term Latin America, and until the good neighbor policy, and you could argue until the Second World War and the beginnings of the Cold War, very few references were made to some region called Latin America. When Washington began to divide up the world into regions during the Second World War and the Cold War, Latin America became a region, and within that region, Brazil, although overwhelmingly the most important country and different from all the others, was regarded as one of 20 Latin American republics. And then, of course, with NAFTA, the focus changed to North America and North American integration, which suggests that there's something called South America, though where Central America and the Caribbean fits in is not clear. And the issue of energy security is primarily the reason for the new and the growing importance of Brazil internationally in general, is the reason for the United States' rediscovery of the Western Hemisphere, in which perhaps Brazil is the most important partner. But from Brazil's point of view, just quickly, Brazil was attracted to the idea of the Western Hemisphere, Pan-Americanism. Brazil always supported the concept of Pan-Americanism because Brazil saw itself as one of two giant countries within the Western Hemisphere. Brazil was never part of Latin America. The concept of Latin America came from America Española, always. And Spanish-American governments and Spanish-American intellectuals never regarded Brazil as part of something they called America Latina. Nor did Brazil wish to be part of something called America Latina. And the point at which Brazil became part of Latin America was when the United States really created the concept of Latin America, which included Brazil. Brazil saw itself within the Western Hemisphere, within the concept of Pan-Americanism, but also with a global role. The role of Brazil in the First World War, the role of Brazil in the Second World War was totally different from the role of every other Latin American country. And in the post-Cold War period, Brazil has again emphasized its global role, much more assertive, a much more clear international presence on a whole number of issues, but under the Lula administration in particular, it's focused, as we've heard earlier, on South-South relations. IPSA, G3, South Africa and India, relations with China, relations with the Portuguese-speaking countries, particularly Angola and Mozambique, and its position alongside the other BRICS. But it's also rediscovered the region. But what Brazil means by the region is not the Americas and is not Latin America, it's South America. Brazil thinks of the region as South America, particularly post-NAFTA and post the Mexican financial crisis. and the summits of South American presidents, and the Comunidade of South American countries, and the União now of South American countries, without any participation by the United States or by Mexico, is an indication of this. The process of integration in South America continues, but the institutional development is extremely slow. And does the United States wish to lead the Western Hemisphere, or North America, or Latin America if it still exists? Brazil certainly is very ambivalent about its wish to lead South America. It's very ambivalent. What does Brazil want from South America is a very, very important question. And there is no followership. Do the other South American countries want Brazil to lead South America? And there are challenges to Brazilian leadership of South America. Its perpetual competitiveness with Argentina, but much more serious, of course, the Bolivarian alternative for the Americas led by Hugo Chavez. And finally, one should bear in mind that in the last few years there's been beginnings of a new external challenge to the region, whether it's the Americas, Latin America or South America. Partly this has come, and not really, though Reardon will talk about this, not so much from Russia, though Russia's relations with Venezuela are interesting to say the least, but of course from China, and the enormous literature that now exists on the relationship of China with Latin America, or if you like, with South America. I'm going to ask Tom Shannon to begin, and then we'll go down the line.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And obviously I'm sitting on a panel with people much more expert than I in many things. Originally I had proposed to speak for only 5 minutes. I was told that past experience proved that was impossible, and I was allowed to speak for 15. But I will try to keep this short because there are so many others up here, and I think the value of this is really the dialogue we establish with all of you. So I just want to start by making a couple of fairly quick points. As has been noted, the U.S.-Brazil relationships over time has been kind of like a Victorian love story. Lots of longing, but very little consummation. But I think that's about to change for the benefit of both. What's striking, obviously, and all of you know this story, is the commitment of President Lula and President Bush to transforming the relationship into something positive for both countries and for the region and for the world. Because, as Secretary Rice has noted, we view Brazil as a regional power, but also as a global partner. And the regional power has to be respected. The global partnership has to be wooed, and it has to be worked at, and confidence has to be built, and accomplishments have to be shown. And this has really been the purpose and the intent of U.S. diplomacy, and I think towards Brazil, and I think it's been the purpose and intent of Brazilian diplomacy towards the United States. And in this regard, what became evident, especially at the beginning of the Bush-Lula partnership, was that our bureaucracies, our way of operating in the hemisphere, was not up to the challenge. But that has changed, and it's changed in a very remarkably short period of time. And it's changed for several reasons. First, Brazil's willingness to define itself in the region, to begin to understand better its leadership role, and to start a larger debate internally and in the region about what it has to offer the region. On the U.S. side, I think it is the result of a recognition that in a Latin America that is committed to democracy, that is committed to open markets, that is committed to integration, and which has globalized, which has connected to the rest of the world, that we are now operating in a far more competitive environment, that we are operating in an environment in which we are not the only option for many countries, and that ultimately this is a good thing, and that countries such as Brazil bring a lot of advantage to us in the region, simply because of their size, because of their weight, because of their economic strength, and their diplomatic reach in maintaining a degree of stability, a degree of purpose in the region, especially where we find ourselves occupied elsewhere, but also a country that brings to international affairs a commitment to peaceful resolution of dispute, that brings a commitment to international law, that brings a commitment to dialogue and cooperation, all of things that are to our advantage. And as Brazil becomes a stronger partner, as it becomes more adept at defining its interests and pursuing its interests, we are capable of engaging in a much more productive way. Because at the end of the day, we want to engage with strong partners. We want to engage with people who understand their interests, who can define their interests, who can defend their interests, because in that sense we know where there are differences, where there are convergences, where we can work together, and where we have to manage the relationship, where we have to manage the differences in order to protect our larger purpose. And I think that for the most part we have been successful in this regard. And we've been successful in an environment that has been incredibly dynamic and has been changing in ways that many of us never expected. There are new political voices in the region, there are new constituencies in the region, there are new markets in the region, there are new global partners in the region, very few of which could have been anticipated with any clarity in January of 2001 when President Bush took office. And I think we can assume over time that 4 or 5 years into the future, this region will look considerably different than it did today. We've got another series of elections over the next 2 years that have the possibility of remaking part of the political landscape of the region, and in some areas remake it in a manner that many of us might not expect, and could bring a greater diversity. But in this regard, our broader commitment to democracy, our broader commitment to open markets, and our belief that we are operating in a globalized world really bode well for what we've been able to do. And one other point I'd like to make is the degree to which Brazil and the United States have been able to focus in joint action in areas like biofuels cooperation, like the fight to eradicate malaria in Sao Tome and Principe, the ability of bringing African countries into the larger biofuels equation, our joint action plan against racism, that we're able to focus on economic and social development issues and also social inclusion issues. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to focus on is not just managing political issues in the region, but showing that reliable democracies with sound electoral institutions have the ability to address development concerns, and that democracies can be revolutionary in terms of developing economic and social development and promoting social exclusion, and that markets and integration are the way to promote prosperity in the region and to ensure stability. And I think that we have a common vision in that sense. We have built a common program which is nascent but very positive. I think we have created guideposts for the next administration that are important. It's my hope that they will follow them. We've been leaving crumbs everywhere. And I believe they will follow them, because President Obama will bring, I think, an experienced and insightful team to the region that will understand how important this relationship is. Let me just close at this point by saying that the word leadership, when we put it out there, we sometimes put it out there to provoke a fight in an event like this, because nobody likes to be led. People like to participate in a bigger movement where they think they have a voice and where they help shape events. And in many ways, this is one of the advantages that our relationship with Brazil has, because the way Brazil has fashioned its engagement in South America, its effort at integration, there's no doubt that it's a power. There's no doubt about its economic strength. There's no doubt about the durability of its institutions, and there's no doubt about its commitment to connecting with the rest of the world and playing a role on the stage. But at the same time, it's been very careful to operate within the OAS, within Mercosur, within UNASUR, and other integration exercises to create a space for dialogue, which has brought other countries in the region towards this larger, more modern, contemporary understanding of South America that Brazil has helped forge, and has clearly defined the outliers, but has done it in a way in which the outliers define themselves. because they have a very different understanding of what South America is and how South America should relate to the world. And in that regard, I believe that the degree to which we can deepen this partnership, deepen this relationship, and manage the differences that will naturally emerge is going to be very important. So I'm going to stop there. But thank you all very much.
Marcel, I think, next.
Yes, good afternoon to all. I'd like to thank Paulo Sotero and the Woodrow Wilson Center for the opportunity to join you here this afternoon and to talk about an issue which is more than a central issue or pillar of Brazilian foreign policy, I would say a passion that is a, let's say, essential feature, a guiding light even of what Brazilian foreign policy is about, but more fundamentally about how Brazil is seeking to define its role in the region and as a result of its greater or wider role as the country develops and as we've seen today. Secretary Shannon quite typically has stolen my thunder, but I still have a bit of a whimper left, so I'll manage to something to say. Seriously, Dr. Bethel referred to the fact that Brazil has changed, and this fundamentally provides an opportunity for a renewed dialogue or a new engagement. Certainly so, but it's not just Brazil that has changed. We have all made references and taken on board the fact that fundamentally we are living at a time when the United States is faced with novel challenges and seeks to reinvent its global role, global leadership, however we might like to define it. But there's a third component, which I think is what I would like to dwell on more and see how this links up to the issues that we have discussed today, which is fundamentally change in South America. I will try to make a brief reference to the Latin America-South America issue without trying to be losing my way, but fundamentally the issue here is that this is a region which is undergoing fundamental, structural, groundbreaking transformations, I would say, that pave the way for what Brazil certainly believes is sustained growth and regional stability within a context, and I recall the Secretary's reference here to social justice and social inclusion, fundamental economic justice. This is not a temporary phenomenon. This is not something that is happening behind the United States' back while it is not looking. These are things that are fundamental, and just as if the United States does not look to world events over the next 10, 15 years, the world will go on, and when they do decide to re-engage, if I may be provocative, they will find that the space is narrower, the opportunities are smaller. And I think this is something which is being grasped quite clearly by American society and certainly by the present and future leadership. What then is the role for the United States in all this? I think Brazil, and this is my fundamental thesis, is convinced that regional integration is crucial in achieving Brazil's wider aspirations in a globalized, interdependent world. Brazil does not wish to separate or be identified as something independent of Latin America or South America, but certainly an expression of a regional process, and insofar as Latin America / South America is able to integrate constructively, productively, competitively into the multipolar world that we are living, Brazil will have a platform, will have an opportunity to develop itself more completely. So fundamentally no conflict here, other than obviously human nature being what it is. As Secretary Shannon said, leadership is something nobody likes to be led, so we'll have to deal with that as we go. So what are the fundamental challenges that the region faces? And then I'd like to look at how the U.S. and Brazil can dialogue and partner on these issues. I think fundamentally what we see is an apparent conflict between globalization and adjustment to a grassroots democracy movement which is going through the whole region. Fundamentally, globalization is about giving up some degree of sovereign control over public policy and retrenchment of large-scale government activity. But on the other hand, what we have seen is, and certainly the present financial crisis has only reinforced and underlined this, there is an enormous outcry for greater government action, policy measures that will ensure that not only do we have answers to the present financial crisis, but that some of the excesses of the last decades overcome, and that formal democracy can become what we in Brazil like to call economic and social democracy as well. Inclusion, making those segments of society that traditionally have not had part an active ingredient, an active actor, if I may be so repetitive. But clearly, institutions are not always there. Consolidating democracy is more than just having regular elections. And this is a fundamental challenge which our region faces. The region is one of increasing social, let's say, economic diversity, political differentiation, but I would like to insist fundamentally that there is a sense of coming together around democracy and the search, as I said, for growth within a context of social equality and dealing with social and economic unrest. But then we are faced with a fundamental challenge, the temptation to avoid, how to avoid the populist temptation, to ensure that democratic institutions are strengthened and not weakened by the struggle to bring about the promised fruits of prosperity. The answer, as I suggested at the beginning, from Brazil's point of view, has a lot to do with regional integration, being a crucial building block in achieving these objectives, bringing the region effectively, competitively into the global market. And Brazil, I think, can be a powerful force to this end. We are all aware of the need for creating economic, trade, energy, communications, connectivity through infrastructure investment that will allow us to have a competitive market. Also the issue of providing development aid to impoverished areas, following slightly on the European model, so that for us, developing a continent-wide market that enhances prosperity and increases competitiveness in global markets is just not a question of free trade. It goes much, much beyond that. At the same time, and this is something that has been alluded to, ironically, Brazil, as it leverages its increased economic and strategic resources in the region, begins to suffer or see the signs of mixed feelings, suspicion, especially towards Brazilian enterprises, which are a cornerstone of a market-led integration process. Clearly, there is a need for a balanced partnership within the region that ensures that all feel a sense of mutual gain. This is very clear, and obviously from our point of view, this is a crucial issue, that the need for institutions, regional institutions, is probably the cornerstone of integration. It is commonly said that integration is an issue of economics, and it is not. It was not the case with the European Union. It was not the case with Mercosur, which began as a strategic, political, military partnership between Brazil and Argentina. And it will not be the case for South America. This is what Mercosur and UNASUR are fundamentally about rule-based agenda that will provide balanced, transparent, mutual beneficial relations. And this is the answer that we are beginning to try to develop. Obviously, building up institutions, it's tough, it's difficult, as we have seen in Haiti. It's not immediately obvious, and the benefits do not come about as quickly as we might believe or might desire. Building up institutions is a regional challenge, but at the same time it's a national challenge. For many countries in the region, I'll just give you one example which I feel to be very significant. Bolivia used to have a national oil or gas company called YPFB. It was privatized during the somewhat called neoliberal period. The result was that when Bolivia came to negotiate gas with Brazil, what did it do? It contracted or asked support from Enron, which you all will recall. There is this, the question is very clear. Petrobras is about, I don't know, 4 or 5 times the Bolivian GDP, 1/80th of the Brazilian GDP. So how is it reasonable for us to believe that you can have constructive, balanced partnering between these two entities? The challenge is one of institutional building, I would insist. It is only when a country is able to develop the technical expertise, which then filters into political credibility, for there to be a dialogue between a society which is very hurt and feels 500 years of victimization, that it will be able in any way to debate and to discuss constructively with a much larger neighbor. We in Brazil know all about this. We've been through this. We still are going through it. So institution building at the national, at the regional level, this is absolutely crucial. So where does the U.S. come into this very complicated equation? I think fundamentally, and much has been said about this, firstly, understanding complex regional dynamics. We very much regret when we feel that the region is being divided into the good, the bad, and sometimes even the ugly, and everybody knows what that is. We must ensure that the sense of commonality of interests, and as I alluded to earlier about the issue of diversity is in many ways growing in the region, but as Minister Jobim said this morning, diversity is the result of increased contact, of increased connectivity, trade, relations. The U.S. has traditionally focused on free trade, national/regional security issues, and we know all about these. The region, South America more specifically, certainly Latin America, has focused on development aid, transfer of technology, trade for development. These are, I believe, perfectly, potentially complementary perspectives. The challenge is how to go about that, how to overcome some of the ideological and some of the historical baggage that we carry. In concluding, I'd just like to suggest that we have heard here much about some of the opportunities for bilateral or trilateral programs. Certainly in the areas of biofuels, we've heard a lot about it. But I would like to suggest that the concept which is become, let's say, very much a common reference nowadays, which is the idea of enabling local communities to transform local benefits or local habits into global gains or global commons, you might like to call it. Social inclusion programs in Brazil, which were mentioned here, are something which clearly provide some of the institutional experience Brazil has had, I think can be very useful in our region. I think U.S. signs that we have heard in recent weeks about issues on which in Brazil we have agreed to. Education as being investment and not just current spending. Protecting the bottom rungs of our society against the downside of globalization. These are issues which we are very, very encouraged to see cropping up in the local agenda in the U.S. Maybe for the obvious reason that these things have been faced quite an upcurrent in Brazil. It has taken years for many of these issues to be accepted by many segments of Brazilian public opinion. The issue of AIDS, another example where fundamental institutional development, which has allowed Brazil over the years to develop a program which ensures, as against accusations from some American, certainly Swiss pharmaceuticals, that this would never work in Brazil. It's a poor country, it's unorganized, and I think we have proved them wrong. I think this is proof how institution building is something that is an export commodity of great possible validity and usefulness. I'd like to suggest that another crucial issue which was mentioned here, deforestation and climate change. I think in many ways this is the cutting edge of possibility for cooperation between our two countries and obviously how this impacts the region. In many ways, these issues I mentioned are examples of services rendered, as I said, to global commons. So certainly in the social inclusion programs, biofuels, and AIDS. I certainly think that deforestation and climate change are an example. But they are different, because I would suggest that this is probably the most significant test case for globalization, because in this case, fundamentally, Brazil, as we have heard today, cannot do it on its own. Brazil cannot provide the economic incentives that it will ensure that trees are not cut down. It is incumbent, it behooves the international community to provide some support. And I'd like to suggest that recent announcements in Brazil about adoption of national targets and the setting up of the Amazon Fund are something to be taken seriously. At least that's what the Norwegians have done. And they have pledged to provide $100 million on a yearly basis as long as this proves effective. It's a national, it's a sovereign project, and it is something on which I think the international community can and should latch onto. Just give you one example, $100 million that on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis, that's roughly, what, 1% of what the U.S. spends on Iraq a year? A month? Something like that, if I'm not too far off. Maybe almost my last point here. Institution building is about identity. It's about building a sense of shared values and the ability to work through differences in a rule-based system. This is why I think the South American Council of Defense, or Defense Council, is so important, and why I think the U.S. could be a very constructive partner in making it a success. What we have heard of lately from American government authorities is very positive, very constructive. Maybe it will suggest that you can be helpful maybe by taking a back seat. That's not something very common, certainly as concerns American security policy in the region, but maybe that's part of the learning curve. Obviously, there's the issue of Doha, a review of the Farm Bill, helping, I think, as has been mentioned, Brazil showed constructive leadership in the negotiations in Geneva. The price we've been paying in our regional relationships in the Mercosur and even with some major partners such as India is a sign that we are willing, I think, to pull our own weight. And obviously, global governance is part of this. And certainly, I believe that as Brazil develops some of these issues, some of these new partnerships, we've mentioned, talk about the BRIC and the G8 outreach mechanism. These are all provide opportunities for taking some of these issues beyond even the region. As a conclusion, I would like to suggest that the U.S. often asks, and I was at a recent Center for American Progress meeting about a month or two ago, the Democratic think tank, and the question kept cropping up from the American side: is the world still interested in U.S. leadership? After all, people keep banging and hitting on us, especially after the crisis, and so much Schadenfreude, no? At the same time, crucial issues of dealing with protectionism, putting the environment first, there's a risk of much of this being sidestepped in the name of fighting recession. And at that occasion, I heard a lot about, well, we can't do so much here because we need to generate employment. Well, we can't do this. Energy can't go up so fast, the price of energy. And this leads me to the simple conclusion that really leadership that the world admires and respects is really about making politically difficult decisions that are in the long-term interests of all. Politically different decisions in the domestic field which benefit the wider community. Leadership is not about the willingness to take your opinions and put them in other people's faces. It's about convincing them about this. So just to provide an inspirational conclusion, I'd just like to say that after World War II, the U.S. led the world in setting up global institutions that help forge the world that has lasted till now. And as we look about how to change and to reinvent many of these institutions, the challenging times that we face now, the world expects nothing less of the U.S. in the new administration that comes, other than this willingness to engage in helping setting up institutions that are really in the interest of all. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. Carlos Pio.
I'll be.
To put it in 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'd like to say how honored I am to be part of this panel. And I was asked by Paulo Sotero to answer two broad questions, and the first one being what are the main expectations concerning U.S.-Brazil relations under Obama, given the current trends and scenarios for South America in the next 2 years. And the second one, if there is any chance, a new U.S.-South America agenda will emerge after Obama takes the oath. On the U.S. side, whether trade and security remain the most important issues. On the South American side, what are the expectations and demands concerning the U.S. Role in the region? I have discovered new features in the PowerPoint 2007, so I decided to use them. And so this one is just trying to sketch how the role of institutions in making ideas and interests that individuals hold mix and influence the content of foreign policy. Most of the people, and we've seen this throughout the day, emphasize the importance of new ideas, bringing change, bringing new routes for cooperation. We usually forget that ideas, as an important scholar in international relations has told us, ideas do not flow freely. Ideas flow with the people who hold them. So I think it's very important to bring to this discussion a way to see whether all these good feelings and good expectations about the development of the U.S.-Brazil cooperation will in fact be productive by looking at who will lead those ideas and try to implement them. So regarding the first of Paulo Sotero's suggestions, the thoughts on U.S.-Brazil relations under Obama, given the current political trends in and scenarios for South America, I would like to invite you to analyze a few data that Latino Barometro has just published in the last edition of The Economist. Of course, I'm being judgmental here. So the blue arrows are supposed to be positive signs, and the red arrows, nothing to do with GOP and Democrats. The red arrows are supposed to be the negative aspects, and there are some odd figures here. And the first one is that Venezuela has the highest levels of support for democracy in the region, 82%, followed by Uruguay, which doesn't surprise anyone. Maybe we are talking about different animals here. What is democratic for the Venezuelan people would seem to me very different from what is democratic for the Uruguayans. Brazil ranks very poorly, and 47%, and the same with Peru, even worse than what Argentina and Bolivia, how they rank. A good sign is that in Venezuela, it seems that nobody really wants an authoritarian government. Again, we can say they really don't know what that means, but it's just a supposition. I'm putting words in the Venezuelan people. Whether in Brazil, Argentina, and Peru, still around 20% of the population does accept the idea that in some circumstances an authoritarian government can be preferable to a democratic one. Just weighting the region, so if you take the non-weighted averages for the region, it seems that we are stuck around 55%, and a little bit less if it's weighted by the population. How satisfied are you with the way democracy works in your country? The blue dots are the 2008. The light blues are 1996. So in most countries, the population is satisfied, even though around the 40% average, except for Peru, where the 2008 figures are consistently worse than the 1996 and 2001. Here comes another interesting representation of how confident we've been with the state level in the economy, and how more confident we've grown about the role that some positions have played, that individuals in those positions have played. Again, we can see how the state should play a much stronger role in most of the sectors, not only of the economy, but also societal roles for Latin American or South American societies. So we are becoming more confident on the state, and we are expecting the state to play more strong roles in our societies. What are we expecting for the next 2 years? And I think Ambassador Barbosa this morning talked about those expectations in the same way that I would do. There are no perspectives of a strong growth path for the next 2 years in the region, and that may bring social discontent, inter-regional disputes over security, trade, investment, and political instability, which we've seen in the last year, in 2008, in many of those countries. Let me talk a little bit about the second issue that Paulo has asked me. Is there any chance that a new U.S. South America agenda will emerge with Obama? First, and it sums up what was said here before, it will decide for both the U.S. and South America on how deep the financial crisis hits the real economy and how long it takes for recovery to be noticed. On the U.S. side, it also depends on whether trade and security remains as the most important issues. These hasn't been very profitable issues for the last years. This is not the agenda that South American leaders want. I'll talk about that a little later. And from the South American point of view, what are the expectations and demands for an Obama presidency? So I think these are basically the important variables that we have to look into to build reliable forecasts. What's been the Obama agenda for Latin America, South America relations? If you look into barackobama.com, of course it has changed. If you look into change.gov, it has changed a little bit. But again, they are talking about a new chapter, starting a new chapter of engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean based on aggressive, principled, and sustained diplomacy from day one. And I've separated those the five important main topics that they've set, separating them in the red and black letters. The red ones and bold are the ones that I think are less independent of the first variable of the crisis, how deep the crisis is. To promote democracy in Cuba and throughout the hemisphere, work towards energy security, advance opportunity from bottom up, trade policy that works for all people in all countries, and advance security across the region. I think that the red ones are the ones that will be prioritized regardless of the crisis. Just to give a sense of the occupation of the positions that deal with the relationship with South America in the Department of State. So you have the Secretary of State. I mean, this is only half of the chart. You couldn't imagine how many of those boxes you would find the other way, so on the other side. But just to see half of it, we are talking about the Western Hemisphere affairs, and the Assistant Secretary is here, and so we are really seeing how important it is to. The big issue now, and of course we are all following it through the news and newspapers and Politico.com blogs, is who will be invited to make the minds of the maybe the Obama and Clinton presidency. New faces, old faces. Some positions have already been assigned, and there is a second tier of people that can play some role. This was speculation from, you all know, journalist Andreas Oppenheimer of the Miami Herald, who's been trying to find out who I have all the names of those that aren't here: Robert Gelbart, Jeffrey Davido, Vicky Huddleston, Pete Romero, and Luis Loredo. These are some of the names that have been talked about to get some of the positions that are open. But there's a strong contrast on what the Obama team has set to do and what the South American leaders want from the U.S. And I think that the basic difference has to do with the fact that South American societies and politicians wanted a U.S. role that really matches the EU role. Politicians want development to be pursued with American leadership, and that is not very realistic. When we put on the paper what that would mean, I would say that in South America, political leaders want the U.S. to give unconditional aid to unilaterally liberalize its trade with the region, finance infrastructure development, and accept more flexible immigration laws. And that I think this is part of the problem, that we are not talking about the same expectations. Not that those expectations would be realistic, but it's even more problematic if we are talking different languages. So in conclusion, I would say that there is a major reason to believe that nothing really important will take place in the next 2 years. This is in part the result of the current financial crisis and the multiple impacts that it has in other countries of the region. But there is also reason to believe that South American leaders and politicians are not ready to take the necessary steps to build a new partnership. There is a lot of anti-Americanism going on. Statism still prevails, and there is a strong sense of voluntarism in international relations, which do not prepare the terrain for strong partnership, cooperation in grounds that could be sustained over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Matias, Spektor.
Sure. Thanks. What I thought I'd do originally was give you my 10-minute spiel about Brazil in the region. I won't do that. I would rather focus on what I think it's one of the most recurrent themes that came out of today, and I think that's it's at the core of a fundamental misunderstanding, in particular in the US, about what Brazil does in the region. That came out as questions, 4 consecutive questions throughout the day to me. And the question is, can the US and Brazil partner up to cope with the regional environment that becomes ever more difficult? And do bear with me, I'm a historian in the very hostile environment of policy. And I'll be brief, I assure you. So the question, can we have a meaningful, productive partnership in the region with the view to help manage the region and add value to the region? Several generations in the US have thought so. If you look at Henry Kissinger or Condoleezza Rice or even Cyrus Vance, all of them tried at several times to engage Brazil in some form of partnership to managing the region. That sort of view is very deeply rooted in history. And yet, for all the wealth of contacts, and we've seen today the amount of things that these two countries do together in the world, the record of US-Brazil cooperation in South America, if we define the region as South America, it's relatively poor. When the two discuss the region, the tone is not one of engagement, it's the very opposite. It's distancing. And on the part of Brazil, what IR scholars call ducking, just hiding from the big power. Ambassador Einaudi, won't mind my saying, because all of the archives from his period are now open, that several times he went down to Brasilia when he was working with Secretary Kissinger, and systematically he tried to tell and ask the Brazilians, what can we do together? And the answer was, we can't do much together because there will be too many accidents on the road. Again, I just loved Marcel's sentence. I think it captures the spirit of the Brazilian response to that sort of attitude in the US. To the question, where does the US fit in Brazil's understanding of the region? The answer is, will you please take the back seat? Why? I'll try to come up with a couple of reasons why. The first one is that on a range of issues, there are very difficult, intricate clashes of interest. You pick it, any big topic in the region, we don't see eye to eye. Narcotics, terrorism, energy security, democracy promotion, hemispheric trade, Plan Colombia, we simply can't seem to agree. On the contrary, in recent years, what we see is an attempt, and we saw this with Minister Jobim this morning. Brazilian thinking has been organized of late, to some extent at least, around the notion that one of the things that adds value to the region is to try and keep the US out of the region, take a backseat, diffuse American influence, not because of anti-Americanism. I'm not sure I would say that there is strong anti-Americanism in Brazil, but by the notion that the Americans meddling in the region, it's too dangerous. The asymmetry of power is too vast to be bridged in any meaningful way. I was looking at some of the statistics with Paolo and Alan yesterday, and if you look at voting patterns in the UN, it's not surprising that Brazil follows the US less than do Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. We would expect that. But it was a surprise, at least to me, to find that that is also the case for Turkey, for France, and even Russia. So clearly, there are clashing interests. The other explanation as to why there is no meaningful cooperation in this field is that there is a perception in Brazil that the power asymmetry always works against Brazil. Some countries have different theories. Some countries actually like asymmetry of power. Canada has done an awful lot in the world based on the assumption that there is enormous asymmetry of power, and you can actually benefit from that. That sort of thinking never took root in Brazil. And that leads to what I think is best encapsulated by President Cardoso in one of his last speeches. Unsurprisingly, it came out again in an interview by Ambassador Patriota 10 days ago. And for all of the divisions within Brazil along party lines in foreign policy, the two used the same expression. And the expression is, it's not good to be on the screen radar of the United States. Não é bom estar no radar dos Estados Unidos. Because being on the radar screen means that either you will be punished or the expectation in Washington will be that you actually do something. That's what the Economist keeps claiming. The Economist hopes that Brazil will actually do things. As someone asked me over lunch, why can't you sort out Nicaragua? Not going to happen. How do we explain this structurally? I think the best answer is that Brazil is not your typical regional power. On any account, it is the largest power in the region. It has over 50% of the people, the wealth, and the territory in its own region, so one would expect Brazil would be the core stakeholder of order in South America. And yet, Brazil has been a very ambivalent regional power, as Leslie pointed out. It's never sought to project power abroad in a big way, in spite of all the rhetoric and all of the important movement towards a more assertive defense policy that we saw this morning with Minister Jobim. Brazil is certainly, as Marcel pointed out, the leading institution builder in South America, and yet an ambivalent one at that. Brazil has been enormously reluctant to pool sovereignty with smaller neighbors, even if they are much smaller. There is nothing like supranationality in South America to a large extent because Brazil is so reluctant. Brazil does not have the same theory as Germany. Germany's model is, if you're the most powerful player in your region, you actually benefit from letting go of sovereignty because your economy and your country work as a magnet, attracting the smaller ones. Brazil does not believe in that theory at all. Now, this becomes all the more clear when we compare US-Brazil relations and the lack of the region in that relationship with US relations with other major regional powers. Think of South Africa or Australia or Turkey. Think of China or India, even Mexico. In all these cases, there is more talk about the region and what the bilateral relationship can do for the region than in the case of US-Brazil. It's quite telling that the best example we have of good cooperation in the past few years is joint work in Africa between Brazil and the United States. I am not claiming that distant relations mean bad relations. On the contrary, the relationship, the bilateral relationship, has been remarkably good, to a good extent thanks to Ambassador Shannon's work, which has been absolutely remarkable from a historian's point of view, at least. And it's quite remarkable that although the agenda has expanded quite dramatically in the past 5 years, there hasn't been tension, big tension. There has been no collision. And I would dare to say that part of the reason why the relationship has been so good is because we don't talk about the region. If we were to talk about the region, then the agenda would be a rather negative one. Now, to the question, can we go on like this? Can we go on not talking about the region? Of course, the skeptical historian will always say, yes, we have done so for generations. And honestly, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. In part because, at least in one thing, Henry Kissinger was correct. 35 years ago this month, Kissinger told in this city his Brazilian counterpart, as Brazil becomes more powerful, your neighbors are going to become trouble to you. And in that sense, he was correct. He wasn't correct on many other things, but on that one he was. And part of the reason why we won't see change, I think, it's because the region is now in Brazil a source of problems and concerns. The language back from the 90s, which was very promising and voluntaristic, and indeed it worked for a while. Ambassador Barbosa was in the middle of it. It was the argument that the region could work as a launchpad for Brazil in the wider world. Or the more nationalistic view was that the region could work as a shield against a very nasty globalized economy. Nowadays, that's gone. The region is not a launchpad and it's not a good shield either. It's a source of problems, especially in the past few weeks. Brazilian policy in the region has not been one of leadership in the past few months, couple of years perhaps. It has been one of damage control, I think. What about the Obama-Lula report? Several times today people said, well, these two guys have personal styles that are so conducive to good partnership work. They are both progressives, whatever that means, and that will work as a source of mutual attraction. If history is of any use, then I think we should be cautious with that. Brazil and the US simply do not see the world in the same way. And on this, we cannot blame George Bush. I mean, it's got nothing to do with Bush. Things have been this way for many, many years, for generations even. So a move towards closer cooperation, I don't think is inevitable in any way. There is one final point I want to make. There is one additional factor that pushes the region away from contact between Brazil and the US. And that's the fact that the notion that Brazil is a brick, the notion that Brazil is one of the few countries in the world that's moving up the ladder of power and influence in the world, pushes Brazil away from the region. Ambassador Barbosa calls it decoupling. And I think there is something to that. If you get all of the major global governance themes that are on the agenda, the region is either not there at all or it only figures very tangentially. Think of climate change, energy security, food security. I'm just reading what I heard today. Global financial architecture, the World Bank and IMF reform, the upcoming review of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2010, Doha, the WTO. you name it. There is, of course, one partial exception. And it was striking to me that nobody mentioned this, with the exception of Biato, I think, just now, and that's Haiti. Brazil is the commanding force in Haiti under a UN Security Council mandate, and Brazil takes up a non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council in January 2010. Now, it's likely that Haiti is going to figure prominently in US-Brazil talks, although, as Leslie said, it's not clear that Haiti is part of Brazil's immediate region, because it's not in South America. But even if it does, my expectation, and again, I'm a historian, I don't want to make any predictions, but I just read Susan Rice's PhD thesis.
The only person in the world.
And it seems to me that the agenda that America will bring to the UN Security Council is an agenda about how to regulate intervention and how to deepen the set of norms and rules that govern collective security in the 21st century. And on that agenda, we certainly are not on the same page again. So in confronting the region, contrary to what we heard this morning 3 or 4 times, Brazil and the US are not natural allies. A partnership, if it is to exist at all, needs to be contrived and planned. Joel is not around, but he's the only man throughout the day who actually came up with a plan for an alliance. The expectation that we will come together naturally and incrementally, I think, is misplaced, at least, of course, for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Matias. That's a very different voice we've heard from much of what we've heard today. Last but not least, Riordan. Right.
I noticed that Paulo's program has something about the Fulbright Brazil, 50 years. You never explained why that's on the program.
You can't remember.
They don't have to if you don't want to. Don't be cranky at the end of the afternoon.
Because it is 50 years since the Fulbright Commission started working in Brazil, and we partner with them to have this, and we have the honor to have 2 Fulbright scholars among us, Carlos Pio and Your Excellency Professor Riordan Roet.
That's what I was hoping for. Yeah. Actually, to the chagrin of many of my Brazilian and American colleagues, I did get a Fulbright to go to Brazil many years ago and decided to stay, like the man who came to dinner. And that was always, I think, a matter of some concern to some of my colleagues. Second, there's some nostalgia here this afternoon. When I came to Washington many years ago, one of the things I did do was to establish a Center for Brazilian Studies at Johns Hopkins, and my associate director, Margaret Daly Hayes, who helped me construct it, is here. It collapsed because of the debt crisis, because of a number of other things, but the continuity with now Paulo Soteiro continuing with this marvelous initiative, I think, is a very, very important one. There was also some nostalgia this morning. Itamaraty always sends very competent and highly professional ambassadors to Washington, but the nostalgia was we suddenly had the Rubens Barbosa juggernaut back in Washington. And the good ambassador spent 5 years harassing us and cajoling us, sometimes praying for us, I think, to get enlightenment about the U.S.-Brazil relationship, in spite of my young colleagues' belief there is no relationship between the two countries. But having that effect back in the city, I think, was, even for a brief time, was very much welcome. And finally, before my serious comments, well, this is a serious comment, Tom Shannon has put up with an awful lot from analysts like me who are anti-Republican and have spent 4 years smiling through seminars and conferences where we have been probably not as pleasant as we should be. But our hope is that indeed the Obama administration rewards him with a major embassy, which he certainly deserves, which may well be Brasilia, and then you can build the relationship. But we on the outside thank him on the inside for being what he was in the second administration, and we'd wish he had been there in the first administration, but we shan't go there. And that's another subject for another dissertation. Let me just make 3 or 4 comments because it is late, and there are cocktails, Paulo, right, somewhere? Okay. And the title for this panel, Leslie and I couldn't figure out, so I'm going to basically ignore it and
talk about something else completely different.
Well, I could talk about my sabbatical next year in Spain, but I think where the meeting of the United States and Brazil is in a much broader context than just a bilateral relationship, and we've mentioned 4 or 5 times during the day the current financial crisis. I think it's absolutely critical, and we had the G20 meeting here just a few weeks ago, in which we had 2 serious Latin American countries and 1 not serious Latin American country participating, Brazil and Mexico, and I shan't mention the 3rd country. But quite clearly, President Lula's voice in Washington is, in that context, an important voice. And his comments about the financial crisis and how the transmission has taken place from the developed countries to the emerging countries who indeed have conducted themselves extraordinarily well raises the very important question that the United States, the G7, the G20, whatever it is now composed, can't allow the crisis, the contagion, to spread deeply into South America, particularly into those countries like Brazil that have made extraordinary strides in terms of their fiscal and monetary policy, in terms of their balances, current and trade, and indeed in terms of the diversification of their economy. Therefore, a major challenge for us, not just in Washington, but elsewhere in the context of whether it's a G20, is to make sure that the line stops. Now, we tried that once before under President Cardoso in 1998, and it failed. But then Brazil today is very different than under President Cardoso structurally and institutionally. So our real challenge here, while we must deal, I would not deal with them, but with the automobile companies, let them all go down as far as I'm concerned, but with the broader structural questions, that is where the hemisphere does come into play and where Brazil is a major player and a major commentator. Second point, the shares and chairs. Fred Bergston at the Institute for International Economics talks a lot about shares and chairs. That is, we've got to increase the share of the emerging market voice in the multilaterals and give them more chairs. And quite clearly, there are just 2 or 3 countries that are going to benefit and should benefit from the shares expansion and from the new chairs at the table. And we have to realize that Brazil is going to be one of those very important players. That doesn't have a great deal of impact necessarily on our bilateral relationship, but it does have a great deal to do with the emergence of Brazil. I don't think Brazil is emerging as a power. We went through a grandeza period in the 1970s, but Brazil is now a player. That, I think, is a more appropriate word. It's a player of increasing importance. It is not a veto player, but it is a player of importance in terms of the discussions at Doha, in terms of the discussions at the G20, in terms of its importance in stopping the free trade area for the Americas, and I do not place any value on that one way or the other, but Brazil's role was significant, and therefore we need to recognize that in those kinds of arenas, Brazil is a player. And the challenge for the United States and for the G7 is to accept that and to understand that indeed the new players emerging, the Turkeys, the Mexicos, but in particular for our concern here today, Brazil does need to be understood as a very different Brazil than it was, let's say, in 1998 or in 1999. Therefore, the issue of financial support, and as you know, both the Federal Reserve explicitly mentioning Brazil and the IMF not mentioning Brazil directly, but clearly indicating special support would be available for Brazil, recognizes the fact that Brazil now is a different Brazil than it was 10 years ago. And the United States, I think, does recognize that, but the challenge for the Obama administration is to understand and to move forward with that. Now, that doesn't mean anything about a special relationship. It's power politics. It merely means that we cannot have contagion from this crisis spread to countries like Brazil, especially Brazil, that Brazil needs liquidity. Brazil needs to come out of this healthier than it was before, or no worse off than it was before, and that's good for the region, it's good for the United States, and ultimately now, given globalization, it's good for the world economy. So, financial support, shares and chairs, and make sure that indeed Brazil is a healthy Brazil as we move forward, because it's important for the region, given trade ties, investment ties, geopolitical ties, and it's important, broadly speaking, for the United States. Second, my recent book is on China, the arrival of China, the expansion of China in the Western Hemisphere. And while it doesn't explicitly focus on Brazil, it focuses on a number of things. Clearly, the interesting relationship and I would even say important, but the interesting relationship, for good and for bad, in South America with China is Brazil. And that is going to continue to be so. And that is an issue, I think, that the United States needs to be very much aware of. We are aware of it. Tom has been to China. I've been to China. Many people are going to China. But to understand what the game plan of China in South America is going to be a challenge to the Obama administration. And I've spoken to many of my Brazilian colleagues about this, many people in the campaign. And that is an upcoming issue that is not going to go away. China is now part of the mix of politics, economics, trade, possibly investment, particularly in South America. And there's a latent concern in some quarters in Washington about the arrival of China in South America. I think I testified in the first hearing in the House 3 years ago probably on this issue, and there was skepticism on the table, particularly on the Republican side, but also on the Democratic side. Who are these people? What are they doing here? Why don't they leave us alone kind of attitude? Well, quite clearly we now know that China has become an increasingly significant brick, or is an increasingly important player, both in many of the frameworks with which when we, the United States, must act, whether it be Doha, whether it be the G20, these issues are now becoming rather repetitive, and the same small group of countries are now becoming the major actors or movers, perhaps not always the decision makers, but certainly actors. And the United States, that's a challenge for the United States to recognize that. Tom does, make sure the next administration does so as well. Good opportunities, bad opportunities in terms of China's presence. There's lots of debate about that, but it's a presence that is not going to leave. It will play out differently in different countries. There are debates in Brazil, as I know and you know, about the presence of China in terms of flooding the market with Chinese goods, about a number of other issues that we're concerned about. But that may be a fact, but it's a fact, as Ulisses Guimarães, I believe we were told this morning, made clear to us, a fact is a fact. Let's deal with the fact. You probably don't know who Ulisses Guimarães is, but I'll tell you later. But the issue we now face is that China is a fact in the region. And the United States, I think, is beginning to come to grips with that. Brazil certainly is very aware of that. And importantly, as we move forward, the United States needs to understand that there will be other actors, perhaps not as good as China in the region. My position happens to be rather positive about the Chinese participation in the region, not quite as pleased with the arrival of President Medvedev, although he does look like one of my graduate students. So that was a positive side of the Medvedev visit to Venezuela and to Cuba. And third point, we need to listen. The United States needs to listen. That's a challenge. And Minister Jobim this morning made a very important point, which was made all the time by nasty scholars. We've got to move on Cuba in the United States. Now, that's been very difficult to do politically in this administration for a lot of reasons. If you read the Miami speech of President-elect Obama, he very directly says we will address the issue of Cuba, not lifting the embargo. The embargo stays. That's a matter for Congress. But other measures can be taken. And as we know, President Lula has been to Cuba recently. There's a very tight relationship diplomatically, politically between Brasilia and Cuba. The only country that doesn't recognize Cuba, besides ourselves, I believe, is El Salvador. It's El Salvador, God knows why. Every other country in the hemisphere does. They're a signal in terms of the challenge for the United States is to move forward on the Cuba issue in an intelligent, informed, careful way that would indeed have very strong implications for the image of the United States in Latin America. Challenge for the United States. And finally, since it is getting late, the challenge for the United States, for all kinds of reasons, and indirectly this would have an impact, obviously, on our relations with Brazil, or our presence in Brazil, is the fact that we have fallen far behind in our presence in the region, not just in Brazil, but Brazil obviously is the region. Why? For a number of reasons. The Fulbright grant program has been slashed. The budget's been slashed. First, second, we've cut back on consulates. President-elect Obama explicitly said again in the Miami speech that he will expand the number of consulates, improve educational exchanges, by which I hope he means Fulbright. And third, the important issue of visas. The United States is losing thousands and thousands of students from all over the world, not just Latin America, because of the visa issue. And we need to address that issue very, very dramatically, because one of the important ties between the United States and South America, Latin America, the hemisphere, but certainly Brazil, how I got my career, with a Fulbright grant to go to Brazil. And those have dropped off very, very dramatically. To a challenge for the U.S. in the context of the region of the hemisphere is to reestablish those cultural, educational exchange programs, which are extraordinarily, extraordinarily important. You can go around to any embassy in Washington, D.C., and people under, say, 30, 35 rarely have had a Fulbright. Anybody in the embassy staff over 45 normally has had some kind of educational exchange experience, and very often it was a Fulbright. Not that we brainwash people. God forbid we can't brainwash ourselves. But the exchange, it seems to me, educational exchange, is an extraordinarily challenge for the United States in the context of our relations with Latin America. And finally, I think what's going to be very important for the Obama administration is to find the appropriate balance in our relations with South America in which Brazil will fit. And that's a challenge for any administration. I've seen 7 or 8 come and go in my time, maybe more, like 7 or 8. And there are always good words. I remember I was part of a Council on Foreign Relations task force in 2000. We wrote this brilliant report for the Bush administration about Brazil and why it was important. And we've said all the same things this morning and this afternoon that we said in 2000 about why we need to pay more attention to Brazil. I should have rolled out that report and read the opening paragraphs, and it could have fit beautifully into our seminar today. So the challenge for any administration is to, in a sense, move beyond the immediate crises, and every administration encounters their own crises, and to try to find space to put Brazil into a context, hemispheric, Latin American, South American, however you'd like to define it, and then to move forward. And hopefully that is what will happen under the President-elect when he takes office on January 20. Thank you.
I'm looking at our leader to ask whether we have time for questions. We do. We have time for questions.
Hit me with a little water.
Hi, my name is Ralph Watkins. I have a question for Tom Shannon. We haven't heard a lot about success stories in the U.S.-Brazil relationship today. One of the successes in the last administration was in improvements in the protection of intellectual property in Brazil. Are there any other success stories that you think that ought to be noted so we can end on a positive note today?
I think the short answer is sure. I believe that the relationship itself is a success story, but in relationships that become complex, in relations that become comprehensive in engagement, obviously problems tend to bubble up fairly quickly. Because one of the things governments do is address those problems, especially as they respond to their investors, to businesses, to civil society, to people seeking visas. All of this becomes important. And one of the tasks of diplomats is to make sure that as these differences and problems bubble up, that they don't overwhelm a relationship. And I actually think we've been pretty good at it. Brazil is in a moment of profound transformation, internally and as it relates to the world externally. And we are responding in our own diplomacy in the region to the kinds of transformations that Marcel pointed out. And I do think that we have been successful in a variety of really important areas. I mean, you mentioned intellectual property. That is a constant challenge, not just with Brazil, but elsewhere. But for instance, one of the things we were able to start during this administration was an economic partnership dialogue with Brazil. And we've had 3 sessions of this partnership dialogue. It's our hope that this dialogue will be institutionalized and will carry on. It is one largely driven by the State Department and by Itamaraty, because the 2 foreign affairs agencies have broad authority in some really important economic areas, whether it's bilateral investment treaties, whether it's working on double taxation treaties, whether it's civil aviation issues, whether it's energy issues. And we have been able to do some important things. We did a civil aviation agreement, which has opened more space for our flights between the two countries. We've worked on important import safety issues. We've started textile sector dialogues. And we've even looked at how we can work within our national regulatory and legal frameworks to promote investment in Haiti, both on the Brazilian side and the U.S. side, opening our markets in a reciprocal fashion. And there will be Brazilian teams up here this month to talk with the Commerce Department and others to determine whether or not this is something we can do under our HOPE 2 legislation that will actually bring hundreds of millions of dollars of investment into Haiti, open U.S. markets to apparel being assembled in Haiti with non-U.S. origin yarn, Brazil origin yarn, and the degree to which Brazil is prepared to open its markets to apparel being assembled in Haiti with U.S. yarn. That's from our point of view, that's a big step forward. And what we found is that when we decide to define our problems in terms of solutions, we've been able to accomplish a lot. And some of the other stuff has been mentioned today. The biofuels thing is actually, I think, a big deal. I mean, obviously, with the price of oil where it is today, there's some question about the long-term viability of ethanol. But I personally think it is viable because it's part of a larger effort at creating renewable energy sources that give societies a diversity of energy sources to choose from and build off of. But more importantly, what's striking about the biofuels approach is that it has three components. It's about first working with consumers of biofuels to create the international standards and regulations necessary to commoditize ethanol and biodiesel and biofuels. That's a big deal. It's a new area of work in international trade issues, and it's an exciting one. The second is the exchange of information among experts in biofuels. And because U.S. biofuels and Brazilian biofuels are so different, cane and corn, we have a lot to share with each other, especially as we look towards cellulosic biofuels. So there's a real synergy there that can be promoted in a way that could have long-term benefit internationally and globally. And finally, there's the idea of working in third countries to build national biofuels industries. We started with programs in El Salvador, Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, and the Dominican Republic. But in the aftermath of the most recent International Biofuels Forum meeting in Sao Paulo, we've expanded that to include Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, Guinea-Bissau, and Senegal. And what's striking about this is that Brazil and the United States are working in small countries that don't have hydrocarbon sectors and are helping them transform parts of their agricultural sector into energy sectors. That is an empowering act, what President Lula calls the democratization of energy. It's an empowering act for countries. It changes their strategic relationship to big energy markets like the United States, but more importantly, bridging the Atlantic and showing that we're capable of working not only in Central America and in the Caribbean, but also in West Africa is a striking comment, because West Africa and other parts of Africa have huge agricultural potential and therefore huge energy potential that again could change how they develop their own energy sources. And we could go on, but I think that how we've established the relationship, the degree to which we've approached problems, and the willingness on both sides to find solutions really does kind of highlight a big success built on all kinds of little successes. But as I noted, this is nascent. It has to be worked on a daily basis. And this is one of the reasons why, as we look forward, the only good advice we can give to the next administration is stay engaged. Keep talking. Don't let them out of the room.
There's another question here.
Yes, Craig Deere from the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. I came interested in hearing the answer to the question about the strategic partnership between the U.S. and Brazil. Paid attention, listened real close. Question for the three Brazilians. I think I heard the answer, but just in case I'm wrong, I heard the answer to me appears to be no. There can be a relationship, two big powers, be practical. Of course, they'll get along, they'll find solutions. But even if we, the U.S., may be interested in a strategic partnership, I haven't heard anybody say yes, and I don't know if you're just being polite and you don't want to say no directly, but I'd really like someone to sort of answer that question for me.
I should be fair to the members of the panel that this was not the main issue on this particular panel. This was the issue for the rest of the day. But of course it inevitably came up this afternoon too. So if any of my Brazilian colleagues would like to...
I should apologize. He's a former student of mine.
If I may start off. Well, as Mr. Jobim said this morning, words are just words. I think for us, the concept of strategic partnership, I think, with the U.S. would definitely be slightly overblown. Why? Firstly, because the word strategic is a pretty charged word. It can mean a lot of things to many people. And when you're talking to a superpower, talking about